Robert Fickbohm, was born in Clay County, South Dakota, down by a little town on the Missouri River called Burbank. And that's where we lived during the Second World War. So that's where I started. I was actually born in Union County, South Dakota, in the back of my great-grandfather's place where he homesteaded. He homesteaded there in 1868. He was in the Civil War in the Navy. If that means anything to you. I found his picture. Some distant cousin got it out of the Navy archives. And I had never seen a picture of my great-grandfather, except in these little photos, you know. And you can't recognize anybody because 30 people in it, you know, relatives. But this here, I don't know, the Civil War, the Navy must have had some good photography because it was better than anything else in that era. Couldn't believe it. A very good picture of him in these woolen bell-bottoms. They even had of them. Interesting.
So what did your parents do? What were their professions?
Farmers. Yeah, farmers. All their life.
So before you went into the military, what were you doing?
Well, quite a number of things. We were a fairly large family and a very small farm. And they really didn't need me, so I was done on my own at 14. And I worked for a lot of prominent farmers, and I was a high school dropout. But I learned most of what I learned from mentors, an awful lot of them, because all the guys I worked for treated me like I was the son, and I really learned a lot. I went back and caught the rest a little later, so I'm not a dropout anymore, but I was in the 9th grade for 50 years. I don't know if that's good or bad, but pretty good average, 50 years. Next question, what was that? I don't think I finished that one.
Yeah, I was just asking about what you were doing before your military service.
And so then I went on. I worked for my uncle and my grandfather in an airport in South Dakota, western South Dakota. And this guy wanted to know if I wanted to take out my wages or whether I wanted to learn to fly. Well, my uncle was standing there and he owned a J3 Cub, so I couldn't turn that down. So I learned to fly and got my license when I was 17, or I had to wait for my 18th birthday to take my check ride. That is some of the things that I'd done before I was in the military.
So did you enlist or were you drafted?
I got drafted, yeah.
And what branch were you in?
U.S. Army. Went to Korea as a rifleman. And then after I got there, I was with 3rd Infantry Division, replacement. And it's about 5 miles behind the line. Well, Outpost Harry was getting hit that night, in those nights, taking 20,000 rounds of mortar and artillery on about a 5-acre patch. If you can imagine that, I didn't want to go there. So when I got called out for an interview with this War Dog outfit that needed replacements, because they needed the type of replacements we were, and I was trained in the field, it didn't take me too long to volunteer because it is a volunteer outfit. Does that answer it? Okay.
So why did you choose to volunteer with that outfit?
I didn't want to go to Outpost Harry because that's where they needed replacements. When you take 20,000 rounds on 5 acres, there's going to be some direct hits on bunkers and foxholes. It wasn't a very good place to go. The average was not very good there.
When you first arrived in Korea, where did you arrive? Where were you first stationed?
I went through Incheon. Went up the front on a little old train that looked like ours would have looked in 1867, I think. A little tiny train, little wooden cars with the windows out. I remember they said, "Don't stand too close to the windows. There is snipers." Well, that little wooden thing, a sniper bullet would have went through both sides and me too. I thought that was kind of foolish, but I just remember it because of what they said. So.
When exactly did you head over to Korea? What date?
I went to Korea in about 1st of April, 1953.
And what did you know about Korea before you went over?
Well, probably all I needed to know because I went through basic training and took advanced infantry, and we were pretty well informed.
So before you were drafted, what did you know about Korea, or what did you think about the war?
Absolutely nothing. Didn't know where it was or why we was going there because I wasn't paying attention. But it caught up with me.
When you arrived at Incheon, can you kind of describe for me what did your journey look like from there? Where did you go? What were you involved in?
Well, at Incheon, we were lined up and we were headed for the front. They threw us 2 days of sea rations in case we didn't find anything to eat the rest of the way, And all these little refugee kids running around there. 1st of April, there was snow on the ground. Bare feet and snotty noses. We give them our sea rations. That's the way GIs are. Them refugees will get to you. They really do. And so then we rode this little train up there for about, I don't know, seemed like about 50 miles, but I don't think it's hardly that far. But then they loaded us on trucks and went to the front, or right near the front. 3rd replacement.
And where exactly along the front were you stationed?
That would be West Central. It's kind of it's in the Jim River bottom flats, just before the Jim River runs into the Han River. The Han River is a big river, but so is the Jim. Very big river. We used to swim in it where it comes out of North Korea, and it's about a quarter of a mile wide and about this deep most places, and really swift because it's a mountain stream. A lot of water. We had one of our boys, 26th, had finished his tour of duty, went swimming, and drowned on his day before he got to go home. That's ironic, but it's the truth. Yeah, things that I remember, that are outstanding.
When you first started working with the dog platoon, did you get training with the dog, or what was that like?
Well, the first thing there is our dogs, the dog that I have, whose name is Hasso, Hasso, he actually had 5 handlers, and I was the 4th one. And so you had to get acquainted with this dog first, because this is a dramatic and hard thing to do, is to leave a dog. And so you have to feed him for a few days and be around him, because he's going to be hostile for a while, because he's still loyal to his master and wondering where he went, and he's been abandoned. And you have to pick up from there, and then you get acquainted. And once he's convinced that you're all right, he accepts you as a master, and then you can proceed with your training. Actually, the dog Hassel had, about 50 combat patrols before I got him. He was not an amateur. And I mean, he had a record there that you take 50 nights in enemy territory, you got to be a good dog or somebody's going to get hurt. And he had done his job. He even suffered with a little PSHD, is that what they call it now? And then they took him off of duty for a while. One handler told me that worked him, just temporary. Golly, worked perfect while I had him. He got over it. Worked just beautiful. Saved my life a good 3-4 times. Sometimes it's hard to say whether he did or didn't. But if he picked up an enemy ambush, you had about 3 or 4 options. So you didn't go in there. You either waited for him to come out because they don't know you're there yet, or oftentimes, and more often, we called in artillery. We were able to do that by our patrol map. They had numbered concentration zones of artillery, and you could call in and correct them. And even a dummy like me, it was surprising how accurate you could get. It really worked, and we did it. Or you could pull back and go home and tell them what you saw. But that was not complete. Our job is reconnaissance and intelligence. Our job was to find out how many there was and what they're up to, because we're also equipped to call in the heavy artillery. We call the line, and then they call in these, what they call core artillery, and they're 8-inch guns, huge. And they can stop a horde if it's a horde of enemy coming. They can do it. Because about the time, or a while before I got there, they came out with what they called radio-controlled warheads. And they could detonate them at any above the ground if they wanted to. And one of them 8-inch rounds would probably, if you're familiar, would probably cover 40 acres. And they fire all 6 guns at once in a battery. There ain't nobody coming through it. It does rain a lot of shrapnel. So that was somewhat of our job. Now, as of course, one other part of our job was to try to pick up a POW, which we weren't too anxious about. One group, I wasn't with that one, but they got one, but somebody shot him before they got back to intelligence again. So that didn't work either, just as well as saved the effort.
When someone was assigned to go pick up a POW, what was the process?
Well, you probably had to overcome the patrol or whatever it was and get them to surrender, and then hoped you get one. We usually didn't do that because we were there for intelligence and reconnaissance. We really didn't want to pack them along, to be honest about it, even though we were supposed to. But it could be done if this opportunity had presented itself. Probably so, yeah. Because the intelligence likes to, get a prisoner and interrogate him. Maybe you'll learn something. They learned more from us than most of them because they didn't know much. They were just there because somebody told them to be there. They were drafted too. Yeah.
What did your duties look like?
Oh, okay. I guess maybe I was a little slack on that. Yeah, there was usually, our little unit, believe it or not, was in constant combat for 17 months. Somebody went out every night, maybe most of the time 2 or 3. In our schedule, 3 one week and 2 the next. So we had a little free time too because we were a special unit. And so that's kind of how that worked. But when we went up there, we were assigned to a line company to pull the men out that we needed to go with us. And there was usually about 12. They would include two medics and 2 signal. They were for communications. They unrolled a wire everywhere they went, this little commo wire. And then we also had the walkie-talkie radios, and that was their job. And then there was about a 9-man infantry squad that done the rest of it, and some of them were, usually the patrol leader was the one in charge of intelligence, as to make the report and that sort of thing. We were first over there, we had to make the report, but when I got there, I didn't have to make the report. Patrol leader did, unless something happened to him. And then I did, but I didn't happen to lose any patrol leaders. But then our job when we went out, I would go up in the afternoon and observe no man's land with a pair of field glasses and to follow the route where our map showed and pick up the notable characteristics of the terrain there, which in no man's land there wasn't much left because it's been so hammered with artillery. There was stumps and junk and a few browned out tanks, but those were the marks that were probably numbered on my map. And then if you need to call in artillery, you got this number, and if that number went along with a dead tree or a bombed out tank, that's how you identified those. And the artillery had those spots zeroed in completely to the nth degree. And you could correct from there, and that's how you directed artillery. Dumb guys like me, So that was part of our job. But most of the time we went out there, we were in front of a patrol. If we were going into the wind, the way we were set up, it was probably usually prevailing winds was northwest as it is here. And that was usually in our favor. But sometimes it could be the other direction. And so then you'd be on the side where the windward side, if it was side this way, that way. That's where the man and the dog was usually, 15 yards ahead of the rest of the 10 men, 12. And that's the way you proceeded. And that dog's nose can pick the enemy up if they got an ambush waiting for you, which they always had. They knew where you were doing and what you were coming because they followed them same old commo wires that everybody else followed, And, so that's the way that worked.
So can you tell me again, last night you were talking about the times that your dog helped save your life. Can you tell me those stories?
I'll probably use what our job was first. And if that dog picked up the enemy, and we could set up our own ambush and wait for them to come out, which was done sometimes. And we could call in artillery if we wanted to. Or we could go back and report it. That was the three options. But we didn't walk into it. So you never sure, but you can be fairly confident that that dog did save your life because you've been walking into something otherwise. And they don't even know you're there yet because he's probably picking them up from, my dog was 450 yards is about what he was average. And we had dogs up to 800 yards could detect another person or an enemy. And it seemed like those dogs soon smarted up to that, especially a dog like mine. He'd done it so many times. He could tell the difference between the Chinaman and the GI. Actually, you could read it on them, just the way they alerted. If it was one of the GIs, they'd probably just casually, look that way and listen a little bit. But that's buddies. But when it was a Chinese, then it was for real. They stopped like a bird dog, pointed. And according to the way you've worked them, you know about how many yards. So you use that for a scale because you know what his maximum yardage is. And you can tell by the winds and a few things. And you can about tell it out whether 200-300 yards, and you're not going to be very far off. That's the way they worked, and that's the way they saved a lot of lives. Before we got there, recon and intelligence patrol got so they couldn't hardly get them to go out again because it was just suicide. But they got confidence after we went with them and did their job like they should. So those dogs did a great thing. There's a lot of us alive because of them. I don't know what you'd use for numbers, but I guess our own little outfit there, you could probably save the lives of 1,000, 1,200 probably in that 17 months. Maybe more, I don't know. Because sometimes you get tied to, probably didn't want to, but there was a big company-sized patrol that were out there to make contact. We didn't think we belonged on them because if they wanted to make contact, they'd go out there anytime and do it. They didn't need us to point it out. Well, it's probably a little handy, but it was too risky for a dog. Those dogs are very valuable, and they need not to be put to that risk of forcing into combat. They had that trouble in World War II. Killed dogs that way, forcing them into combat. That isn't what they're good for. Yeah, you can do it if you have to, but not a good idea. The statement of charges on one of them dogs, if you misused one, was $1,700 at that time, which was quite a little bit of money for a corporal. You better take care of that dog. Does that answer it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You said that there was the one night where, I forget if it was you or another, had to go through the minefield. That
was a buddy of mine. I didn't actually go through a minefield, but he's a good buddy from the state of Minnesota, where we're at. But they got lost one night, couldn't find their safe lane. Maybe he didn't get up there in the afternoon and look it over good. Maybe he didn't. He was a lumberjack, and I think he was fairly thorough and knew what he was doing, but they got lost and could not find the safe lane back in to the minefield. Well, it's getting about daylight, and they got to get out of there, because if they enemy sees you, you're going to get hammered out with mortar and artillery. You ain't got a chance. So he just pointed that dog through a minefield and followed him. And a dog's sixth sense kicks in here. You've heard of it now, and I'll give you an example. He just followed that dog and pointed him through there. And he watched. If that dog zigzagged, well, you zigzag too. Because he has his nose, or whatever it is, I don't know, you can't even say nose, I guess. It's just a sixth sense. He can sense danger, and he'll go around it. If you're smart enough to read him, you go around it. And they went through this minefield. They got through it, and they're busy concentrating on each other, naturally. Looked back and no patrol. They didn't have guts enough to follow him. They went back through that minefield, got that patrol, and led them through that minefield without a casualty. That's something that they weren't trained for, but they did. And this is just one case. It happened a few times. But, you know, in no man's land, there was mines and booby traps, all that kind of stuff. Like these cute little flags with these 80 millimeter mortar flare flags, cute little nylon or silk things. They're kind of fun to pick up and send to the girls. You know, they're about 2 foot square. You better leave them alone because they're allowed to be booby trapped as much as you'd like to have one. Things like that were booby trapped out in there. There was 1,000 ways to die in no man's land, between the lines.
Can you tell me any other stories that kind of stand out in your memory of working with the dogs?
You read my book and you'll have them all, or a lot of them. There's a lot of incidents in there. And so, but for personally, probably my most dramatic ones was a dog's sixth sense again. This is 2 nights before the war was over, and the Chinese overrun the rock division next to us, South Koreans. And we were in the process of changing divisions online when this occurred, or just a little prior to that. They changed this a little later. And so 3rd Division was going into reserve, and 2nd was going online. Well, we were attached to 3rd C, and so then we reattached to 2nd. Well, 3rd didn't even get into reserve before they put them over there behind the rocks to stop them. Well, in about 2 or 3 weeks, things quieted down over there, and they held their ground with the 3rd Division behind the rocks. And then they wanted to know what the Chinese are up to up there. So then they had worked with dogs probably almost a year. We had spent quite a little time with 3rd Division on 2 different occasions, about 6 months at a time. So we had a lot of time with 3rd Division. And then they wanted a couple of dogs and dog handlers to go out on recons there to see what's going on up there. So I went out this night where the rocks had thrown things down and run. There was just junk and piles of trash, you know. The 3rd Division infantry is sitting back there, not dug in, just sitting in foxholes, covered up with a poncho, keep from getting wet. They had their first hot rations the day I got there. Otherwise, they'd been on sea rations for a month. And they were lean and mean. You had to go through them at night. And you had to go through the rocks at night. And then the Chinese are up above that, you know, where you're supposed to go. They're equally dangerous at night. Equally dangerous. So it's kind of too many trigger-happy people, you know. Well, anyway, this night we get up there, and it's quiet and nice up front. Nothing going on, you know. Didn't see or hear a thing. So we went as far as the patrol map told us to go, and we were, usually it went by, we had different checkpoints on this map, and we was probably on about the 3rd one, and then the 4th one and the 5th one are on the way in, and you count noses once in a while, because it is possible out there you've got some enemy, like the SEALs. They can pick the last man off your patrol, and it happens, you know. So you'd count noses. Well, this night, we're 2 men short after this little fiasco up online where the mortar rounds is coming in. Maybe I got ahead of myself there, did I? Yeah, I did. Well, anyway, as we started to go back in with two men went up on this ridge to see what, so he didn't move into something. And I think I shouldn't have allowed it because the dog he could tell that as far as they could. And the enemy were on the other side of the hill, maybe not over 500 yards, but the wind was carrying the scent up over us. So the dog was not picking it up. If you'd have been up there where they was, the dog would have had it, but which would have been another 200-300 yards probably. But he wasn't there. So anyway, they find out that there's one of our patrols on the other side of the hill. So they sent up 5 mortar rounds to feel us out, see if we're there. Well, they were on too. We were scattered about a block long, sideways across this back of this ridge. And they got one man on the far side, and I'm up front, the opposite side. And I don't think he was too badly hurt. They weren't large mortar rounds. They were probably like our 60 millimeters. But he was scared, I think, more than anything. And he's hollering for Mama. I mean, some of these boys do that. There's Mama's boys. I can't imagine it, but he did. If he'd have been beside me, I'd have had to use a rifle butt on him. I couldn't have, because he's endangering the rest of us. Well, the medics finally got him shut up over there. I thought, oh boy, now they'll fire for effect. But apparently the wind or something, they did not pick up his sound because there was only 5. But anyway, this is the first round. Then the 3 more come in, and they were a little, I suppose maybe 30 yards over. And I looked at this big German Shepherd, Hassel. He's digging. Oh, I know he knows something I don't know. The next round must be ours. So I just grabbed him and I hugged the ground tight. And we took that round within about 8 feet of us on the uphill side. If it had been sitting up like I was and him, I'd have got that round, that shrapnel in the back of the neck between the helmet and the flak jacket. He'd have got it in the face. It had finished us. But tight on the ground, him and I got the dirt and the shrapnel went over us. Pretty close, but yeah, he saved my life that night with his 6th sense. Fantastic. But that's what those dogs were capable of and did. Of course, as I said, he was no amateur. He'd been there before, 50-some times.
So can you tell me about your book and kind of why you wrote it and what it's about?
Okay. I don't know. With our unit, I've wound up being a coordinator in we've had 12 reunions, and I think I've done 3 or 4 of them. And so I kind of wound up in leadership, And they encouraged me to write a book. I didn't have any intentions of writing a book. Well, then my daughter, she puts the pressure on because she's a cut-and-dried historian, history up to here. And she got me interested in it. And I had picked up a lot of stuff while I was in Korea. And so I wasn't just, I don't know what the word is there, I just knew quite a bit of our history. I guess just a little bit historian myself. I really am now, but a little then, But the reason we decided to write this book is because scout dogs, there's a lot of different kinds of training dogs. And the Air Forces, Navy, all those air bases all use dogs, and they have for years and years, and they never quit either. And so the problem was, we were working with intelligence, our history was not declassified till 1992. So you will not find it in any of the history books. So that's the reason I wrote this book, because nobody really knows what a scout dog done. And they did some miraculous things, even more of it in Vietnam. But that was kind of due to us too, showed them what they could do. But there was a lot of them. But ours was the very small unit. And so, let's see, I lost my chain of thought there. Repeat your question.
Just tell me about the book, why you wrote it and what it's about.
And so that's kind of the reason we wrote it, is because there was history there that was not revealed. And I ran into a lot of people that never heard of them. This documentary I was in, I told you, with South Dakota Public, that lady was really fascinated. She had never heard of such a thing before. Well, we decided, and this is after that I wrote the book, that it needed to come out somewhere. So that's kind of the reason I wrote the book. And I didn't really have public in mind when I wrote it. And I may do an abridged edition yet because it's a little bit brief. Because I'm talking to dog handlers and their children. Because that's who I wrote this book for, is my buddies and all their kids and grandkids. So it goes on and on. And they will have a record of it. So that's really the reason. And so some of these incidents are a little bit brief for somebody that doesn't know anything about dogs. But by the time you get done, you'll have a pretty good idea of what they had accomplished. The book that I have written is called Brave Cold Noses and Brave Hearts, Dogs and Men of the 26th Infantry Scout Dog Platoon. I pulled the name from some outfit in Arizona had written some dog stories, and this they had entitled it, but their title went on a little bit different. I had to change it a little, so I kind of copied that Cold Noses and Brave Hearts because I thought it was very fitting, because that's what it is. Those dogs, when they're working for you, they aren't afraid of anything. They'll do anything for you. So the Brave Hearts is dogs plus the nose, but the boys that got to work with them are brave too. If you're a coward, you're not going to last. And that's another thing, that if you are scared, this is going to reflect on the dog, and he's not going to perform like he should either. So you can't be scared either. You got to be confident of what you're doing. It's kind of an ingenious thing, but that's the way it works.
You said you were near Jim. Can you tell me, were you in that same spot pretty much the whole time?
Well, when the 26th came into Korea, they came in at Pusan, not Incheon. And they went up and they were kind of divided up into a couple of different units too, and did not go with one division. They went with the 45th Division and the 7th Division, and they came on up into the line, and for a while they didn't have tents. They had to sleep in open. There was no facilities for them. And they had to sort of gather some of these things in order to live out there. When you got nothing but sea rations and a poncho and a sleeping bag, it's a little bit light. So they had a little trouble getting established. And then after they got established, the general of the 7th Division wasn't satisfied quite with the way they were trained, because these guys had not taken advanced infantry and they had not taken map reading. And they went back into training for 6 weeks again, I guess, before they really went into battle. And it was kind of a different thing for them, because they went out of a safe place into combat. We had a little, after a few months, then when rotation and things and new men come in, we had a policy that when you learn about your dog and how he worked, you went with another guy the first time out to see how he did it, and then he went with you. And that eased it a whole lot from going into combat cold turkey. That's pretty tough, you know. Besides, you're in an advisory, you're maybe not the patrol leader, but in a way you are.
So you're referring to the platoon before you joined it, kind of the platoon's history?
Yeah, because I was in the last 3 months of the war, so I was in the tail end of it. I was only in combat for 3 months.
And did you say you were in combat before you ended up volunteering for the dog platoon, or no?
No. I went directly with the dogs and went into training. We trained for about, part of the last week of April and all of May and the first week in June about 6 weeks. I mean, those boys in the field that had just finished a tour, they pulled them off maybe 1 month prior to going home. And then they were instructors, and they trained guys like me. And you paid attention because those boys were combat veterans. it wasn't like at his estate. They could do in 6 weeks what would take them 16 weeks here in the United States, just because they got the important things, and you kind of learn the rest on your own. But there was some important things that saved my life probably. For instance, I was out one night and old Hassel picked up a enemy, and so I asked this lieutenant. He asked me, I guess, I said, now what do we do? Well, he was the green ROTC lieutenant, second lieutenant. Well, he'd never had any training. He had no idea, but he still had to try to lead a group. And the only one that had any experience was me. So he leaned on me for that. He said, what do you do? I said, well, we got about 3 options. And he decided that to back off a couple 300 yards and call in the artillery on this alert, even though we hadn't seen them, but we're pretty sure they're there. Well, they dropped it. They come in with 5 rounds of 105s, and they put them exactly where we wanted them. And we sit there, and it's quiet for about a half an hour, and nothing come out of there. And so he says, I suppose we should go up and see what we've done. Then I think of one of my instructors. He says, this happened to one of those boys. They did that. Well, it happened to be an outpost, and they were dug in, and them 5 rounds like we got had not much effect if they had a bunker or even a good hole, a foxhole. And so I said, no, I don't think we better do that, because we could get ambushed again if we didn't get them, because we don't know for sure. So he listened to me, and I think he's going to be a good officer because he did pay attention. Well, we went back and we observed for another half an hour, and they made a mistake on fire control, and they put 5 rounds in the exact spot again. If we'd have moved up, we'd have got taken out by our own artillery. There was some guys that was glad I talked him out of it. And after the war was over, I was driving for a captain one day, because I did a lot of truck driving and driving over there, because motor pool knew we had time off in between, and so we did a lot of that. If you were capable, it was darn hard to find a decent driver. All the boys from the east and the southeast never drove because they used public transportation. The truck drivers were yet harder to find, and so I always got sucked into that kind of stuff. But a little off the track here, but that's kind of the way it went. We had 3 new GMC trucks after the war was over. The brand new GMC 6x6s with the Allison 5-speed transmission that you never heard of here till 1980. I don't know why, but we had them. And so I was elected to drive, and I had about a dozen troops in the back, and I'm in this mountain pass. And by that time, when we got a new issue, they gave the old issue of the old World War II trucks to the South Koreans, and they hadn't much experience or any, and they were driving those trucks and not much experience. Well, I comes around this corner, and there wasn't a lot of speed involved, 15, 20 mile an hour probably, But here's this South Korean, one of our old GMT trucks from World War II, and he's afraid to get out on the edge, and I'm on the inside. And if we hit either way, we'd have spun and over the edge and 1,000 feet down, And I cut that so close. Being a professional truck driver, my right front wheel rubbed the rocks. I lost the mirror off the left side, but we're all alive. We're all alive. That's one incident. The next incident, later on, I was driving one of the old 3/4-ton Dodge power wagons. And they're kind of like the tires of today. Most of the tires, they had tires about this wide, like we got now. The same thing occurs, only this time he's on the inside, but he doesn't want to rub the rocks, so he's crowding me out. And I had to cut, I think I hung half of that tire over the edge. But we're alive. And that captain looked at me, he was just pale, but he was glad to be alive. Some incidents like that, because there was so many accidents. Actually, after we got to writing this book, we were getting monthly reports from the different infantry divisions, because if we had an incident during that month, why, it would be in their archives. And we had this lady go into archives for us, and she'd find this. But we had to find it in 6 or 7 different infantry divisions because our history is scattered all over. And that's what we had to do to find out some of the things we wanted to know.
Are there any like friendships that you formed while you were there that really stand out to you?
Lots of them. Because this little unit of ours, you know, we were together all of the time that we were in the military, except basic training. Of the 2 years, we were together in just a bunch, like a family. This 26 was like a family. And those are brothers. And so they're all brothers. And it stays that way, and it'll always be that way. We're getting thinned out a little now with age, but that's the way it is.
This 26 is the platoon of dog handlers.
Yes. Of course, the dog handlers in general, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and then the boys today in Afghanistan, Iraq, we're all brothers. Every single one of them, and there still doesn't amount to too many. They're always small units, but 4 wars and we're all brothers.
What kind of connection or like communication do you have among each other?
Well, that's kind of a long story. You want it?
Sure.
Well, the Vietnam dog handlers and us are pretty close, and so we kind of overlap on that because this 26th, after the 26th was a combat unit, and then when it came home, then there was the 25th, which was a training unit in Colorado, Fort Carson, Colorado. Well, then they trained the 25th and sent them to Vietnam, and the 26th became a training unit at Fort Benning, Georgia. That was the last that the 26th actually did. Not the men, but the unit. So that's kind of the way that went. And you asked me one other thing there, and I forgot what it was now.
What, like today, what kind of connection or communication do you have among?
Well, U.S. Army Special Ops, and this is quite a unit. Security is really tight. Well, we have a website, or my daughter has it with the 26th. They got a hold of that. They wanted to know if she had 2 combat dog handlers. They was sent to a conference, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Well, I was one of them, and another guy from World War II that was with the 26th. We only got 2 of them that we can found, and one of them died last month. So we only got 1 left, but he's the one that was with me. And we went back there and related our experience and the things that they wanted to know. And there was a number of things that they wanted with combat veterans. And I had about 70 to 80 instructors and officers. You can't corner an officer in U.S. Army Special Ops. They don't wear no rank, and some of them, half of them are in civilian clothes. You don't know who they are or who's running the place till you've been around there a couple of days. And that much I can tell you, but that's about it. So now I'm affiliated with them too, after the story I gave them, which is rather interesting. So I'm back under intelligence again. I just got out in 92 and I'm back in.
So you continued in the service until 92? Or what did you do beyond what do you mean?
No, I was in agriculture from 1954 or 55 when I come back. I was in farming and fertilizers and herbicides. I had a service unit. That's what I came home to do, yeah.
So when did you rotate home?
Would have been in June of 54.
So you continued on even beyond the signing of the armistice. You were still there.
Yeah, I only had, that was a rotation system, was by points, and I think it was 34. I only had 15, so I couldn't get out of there. Well, in a way, I guess that was the way it should be, because the combat veterans that at that time that had close to 30 units, they let them go home early. Well, that left guys like me, and we had to replace them. So I was an assistant platoon sergeant. My buddy here from Huron, South Dakota, he was platoon sergeant. And it was our job to get a bunch of replacements and train them and get this thing up to snuff again, because we were sure the Chinese were coming over the hill. They were just hauling in ammunition and whatnot. It didn't happen, but we were sure it would. So that was our job that time. The next, well, it's about 8 months after the war was over. We trained and got this thing up to par.
What did it feel like just following the signing of the armistice? What was the atmosphere like?
You'll have to read that chapter out of my book, I think. That is something that I won't ever forget, I guess. That day when that armistice was going to be signed, I don't know what occurred, but the artillery on both sides decided they was going to get rid of all their ammunition, and they fired it. Man, it was so noisy you can't imagine it. And we were in this temporary situation with a little what do we call them? CQ tent, I guess. A little one, 2 or 3 of us in there with the dog. And there was a 105 unit behind us about a quarter of a mile or less. And that day, that valley we were camped in there was behind the 3rd Division. And the Chinese rounds, I could see them about a mile down the road coming in. And this battery was firing behind us, and every time they'd fire the whole battery at once, 6 guns, our tent would just go whoosh, like that, you know. I tell you, it was noisy. We didn't think it ever going to be a truce because it was intensifying, you know. And then later on, I couldn't see for the powder smoke, and I wasn't about to go any further at the front because I could see the rounds coming in. I was kind of in between, watching it. And this went on all day till 11 o'clock that night, 2,200 hours. And then the truce said it was so quiet as a morgue. You just couldn't believe it could be that quiet, you know. And it was for real. I guess it stayed quiet. But later on, I was, one of our boys lives in Salt Lake City, so I stopped and visited with him. And his wife says, there's a book here you ought to read. And it was entitled A Chaplain's, well, anyway, it was his story. So I started reading the book, and I find out that he's still in Salt Lake City, and this lady, she works at the Senior Citizens, and she says, well, I'll call him and you guys can visit today. And so I'd read part of his book, but not all of it, and we spent the day together, and we found out we were the same place this day the war was over, only he was further front. He was one of them who was sitting at a foxhole, and I thought those were random rounds coming in from Chinese artillery. It was not. They had the 3rd Division zeroed in, and they were sitting in foxholes. And I'll tell you, it was a slaughter that day. He was one of them. He was a chaplain. He got the Silver Star that day for saving a lieutenant that he was dragging back to the medics. And while he was doing it, he had another guy with him, and more rounds come in, artillery rounds. So this guy, he drops the stretcher and runs. And this chaplain, he throwed himself on top of this lieutenant to shield him from the shrapnel. And he took a piece and messed up his knee. And I had no idea this was taking place, that there was a slaughter going on down there. But here I'm behind it, so near, but in the powder smoke, couldn't see him, you know. You know, when I read that report that what was going on that day in front of me, so close, I had lost a night's sleep over that book because it was really touching, because we were there together.
So when you rotated home, what was the reception like, or what did it feel like to come home?
Well, it wasn't quite like the Vietnam. That was a debacle, and it should have never happened. But, you know, the people were, you know, Second World War was over with, and then this Korean thing, they were so used to it they didn't pay much attention. Well, I got the Bronze Star for meritorious service, and my picture was in the Yankton paper in South Dakota and some others. 1,000 people probably seen that, of all my relatives and neighbors, Never a soul even mentioned it. That was a little, disappointing that they didn't even recognize that I was a decorated veteran. So it wasn't bad coming home, but it could have been a little better. And then we got all the recognition you ever imagined when it come our 50th anniversary here in 2003. Then they really poured it to us. It has been that way ever since. But it was a little disappointing when we came home. But I feel much better than the Vietnam boys. That was so terrible. Even for the dogs, there was a lot more dogs over there. But they were euthanized. And that's, you imagine thinking your dog is being euthanized if you're a scout dog handler. It's got to be awful, because he should have went home with you. And now, as of 2 years ago, the Air Force took this to Congress, and there will be no more of that. Those dogs will be treated like veterans, and there won't be any more of that euthanizing them. And of course now they got a better deal. They're coming home with their masters, and I like the way they're doing it. Because I told you I'm affiliated with, so I know the boys. Those boys that in Afghanistan, like grandsons to me. Why wouldn't I help them, And I have. Kind of interesting in a way, because addressing these 80, probably 70 or 80 officers and instructors who are paying attention real well. I'm going to say one thing that I told them that I think I can say. I said, you guys are killing too many men and dogs with your daylight patrols. A dog isn't any better in the daytime than you are. They rely on their eyes. But at night, when the air is cool and maybe a little damp, that nose goes into effect. And I said, the darker it is, the better that dog works. These boys are paying attention now. They really were. Well, when I got home, I see on the television one night, old Karzai, he's complaining. U.S. Army Special Ops is making midnight raids, and they're highly successful, just as I told him to do. That's kind of rewarding for a guy that's 80 years old and thinks he has nothing to do with modern warfare, because he has.
Are you involved with the local chapter?
Well, I'll soon have 60 years with the American Legion. I've been a commander for a number of years, and an assistant commander. I've been a chaplain, so I've been in that for years. I'm with the VFW too, but I came into it later, so I'm involved with the VFW too. So that's some of the things that we keep doing. Try to keep the local people a little patriotic and remind them of what they need to be thankful for. It's like my sister one time, she said, that's foolish, all this war. They could just not be sending you guys over there and getting killed. I said, that's not a veteran's attitude, because if you've ever been there, and I was telling you about refugees, if you've seen them, you don't want it to happen here to your family. If we got to fight a war, we'd sooner do it over there than we would here. But she didn't realize that, and there's a lot of people that don't. They think we're wasting lives and wasting people, but that's the way we got to look at it, because if we ignore it, we're going to find it on our shores, which we already have in 9/11. It's that close.
Is there any message that you want to pass on to younger generations?
Well, I guess being we're telling the story of scout dogs. When I was back to Fort not Benning, but Bragg, I come away there with a different attitude. I thought there was nothing we had to contribute to the modern war. All these guided missiles and these little airplanes that you don't even have to fly. They go up and do the reconnaissance and that sort of thing. But they cannot replace that war dog. Military working dog, they call them now. Machines cannot replace a dog. Machines don't have a sixth sense like a dog has, and you can't train it to do some of the things that you want it to do. And there's still a place for them, and there always will be. Well, now, it's hard to believe, and I didn't think it would work being a dog handler. These IEDs, these dogs I figured they'd have to be too close when they found one that would kill the dog. And it is hazardous business, but they're doing it. They're finding them. And they've gotten trained now, they got it down to a system, and these dogs are very effective. It's a little harder on dogs maybe, but, well, we lost dogs too. We have a tremendous record as far as the 26th. We've got, over the time of this 17 months, we've got 1,538 night patrols, and we lost 5 dogs and 4 men. And you get to the Vietnam dog handlers, and they just worship us. They think that's a fantastic record, which it is. It just tells you what that dog did.